Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being here and being part of our speaker series for the Energy and Environment Specialty Group. And this event is also co-sponsored by the Economic Geography Specialty Group. So we thank them for their co-sponsorship and we welcome all the participants today. My name is Tiffany Grabelski. I'm one of the co-chairs of EESG. And it's my pleasure and great honor today to welcome Dr. Conor Harrison, our guest speaker and very accomplished intellectual leader in our field. I'm just going to give a little bit of a biography. Dr. Harrison is an economic geographer that received his PhD in geography from the University of North Carolina in 2014. He also has a master's degree in geography from East Carolina University and a bachelor's in political science. He has work experience in supply chain management and consumer product distribution. He has been at the University of South Carolina since 2014 and has a joint appointment between the Department of Geography and the School of Earth, Ocean, and Environment, and currently holds the rank of associate professor. Dr. Harrison has won awards for his teaching, and I have personally benefited very much from and been inspired by his contributions about teaching critical resource geographies and how to incorporate research into the undergraduate classroom. Dr. Harrison's research examines the relationship between energy, society, and economy. He's been the leader of an interdisciplinary research project examining regulation, energy insecurity, and energy labor in the southeastern US, funded by the Sloan Foundation. Dr. Harrison's past research has also explored the historical development of electricity supply systems, regulatory regimes, and energy markets in the American South and the Eastern Caribbean. And his contributions to our field are very significant, as evidenced by his publications in top journals, including the Annals of the Association of American Geographers, Environment and Planning E, Geoforum, and Energy Research and Social Science, just to name a few. Dr. Harrison's current project examines the U.S. electricity system as it transitions to more renewable forms of energy, with a particular focus on how the financial industry is influencing changes or lack thereof. This research is supported by the National Science Foundation, and please join me today in welcoming Dr. Harrison, whose talk today is about this work and is, as I understand it, a preview of his forthcoming book. So thank you very much, Dr. Harrison, and we're honored to have you with us today.
Well, thank you for that really nice introduction. And as you started reading all those things off, it made me feel old and tired and maybe ready for retirement, although that doesn't seem to be coming quite fast enough. So thanks everyone for coming. Thanks to Maddie for the invitation back in the fall. And thanks for everyone for coming, especially during this time of kind of insanity with everything going on in the world. So it means a lot that you've taken time to come and join. So Tiffany's correct. I'm excited to talk today about a book that's under contract with the University of Minnesota Press. Right now I'm doing the final revisions on it. So hopefully it'll be in print this time next year. So before I'll put some slides up, but I just want to talk for a second about my motivation for this project. So this started, I think, 7 or 8 years ago. I started thinking about this problem when I realized that I had been teaching and researching in the area of energy geographies for probably almost a decade at that time. And then I had to really be honest with myself and realize that I didn't understand the US electricity system. And I was at the AAG in New Orleans. I think I looked back and it was 2018, and I was talking to Sarah Knuth, who many of you might know. And I said, somebody really needs to write a book about the electricity system in the US. And Sarah said, well, why don't you write it? And I was like, oh, that seems like a bad idea. But I went with it. So, however many years later, this is what I've come up with. And so the talk that I'm going to give today is going to be pretty broad. I'm going to talk mostly about how I kind of conceptualize the issue of the relationship between the electricity sector and the financial sector. I'm going to talk a little bit about how I kind of carried out the research for the project. And then I'll give just a little preview of some of the different chapters to give you kind of a flavor of what's going to be in the kind of the more empirical sections, more of the book. So I'm gonna share. Let's see if I'm going to do this right. Is that working? Okay, great.
Should be all good. We can see your slides, but not your notes.
Okay, good. All right. So the name of the book is Brokers of Power, Finance and the Changing U.S. Electricity System. And I'll start on it's, almost the anniversary of this. So on February 14th, 2021, the lights went out across much of Texas. The frigid weather associated with Winter Storm Uri descended upon Texas and shut down much of the state's electricity grid. Power wouldn't be fully restored until February 19th, and at its peak, only about 60% of the state's electricity capacity was even available. Over the course of those 5 days, the blackout was more than just an inconvenience. There were more than 250 deaths, and there's been $195 billion in property damage that have been attributed to the event. The electricity market and grid in Texas are operated by an entity called the Electricity Reliability Council of Texas, or ERCOT. And one of ERCOT's primary responsibilities is to create daily forecasts of electricity demand based on historical electricity consumption, current weather forecasts, and some other factors. Electricity generators then bid into an auction, with the winners agreeing to supply a certain quantity of electricity at a particular price. And the winning bids are compensated for the electricity provided at what's called the market clearing price. That's the highest price bid that is needed to meet the demand forecast. So in this way, it's the market rather than some sort of central planning operation. It's the market that performs the crucial function of matching electricity supply and electricity demand. And Winter Storm Uri didn't take ERCOT operators by surprise. The meteorologists employed by ERCOT knew that bitterly cold weather was coming. And given that frigid weather forecast, it was clear that there was going to be a substantial supply of electricity was going to be needed to meet that heightened demand. Yet the grid was unprepared. There's a whole variety of reasons. But multiple power plants were already offline for scheduled maintenance. And as the freezing weather set in, hundreds of plants would be forced to shut down. And large parts of the natural gas network had frozen solid, as you can see in the picture here. What's remarkable about this case is that even while millions were without power during the freezing temperatures, some $46 billion of electricity was sold in the Texas electricity market in a single week. To put that in context, that's 5 times more than the state of Texas spent on electricity during the entirety of 2020. And in the weeks that followed, it started to become clear who had captured some profits from Uri: financial firms. For example, the Macquarie Group, an Australian investment bank, indicated that its gas and electricity trading activity in Texas had earned it $215 million during the storm. The Bank of America, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley also reaped massive profits from electricity trading. And beyond electricity traders, some electricity generators that remained online during Uri also managed to rake in massive profits. A prime example is Temple Generation 1, which were the owners and operators of a 758 megawatt natural gas power plant in Texas. And Temple managed to keep generating power during the storm and reported earning $200 million in a single week. That's a pretty substantial return for a plant that cost $752 million to build in 2012. So while it was a big winner in Uri, Temple Generation is not one of these big electricity companies that we come to know, right? It's not owned by one of the traditional electric utilities like Duke Energy or Pacific Gas or Electric. Rather, Temple was owned by a consortium of investment firms that included Guggenheim and an asset management arm of JP Morgan called PIMCO. And if you look at Temple's history, it wasn't exactly glittering. It was developed by a company called Panda Power in 2012, which is something I always find interesting, is that they also were a big investor in minor league professional wrestling. And while the plant only entered service in 2014, it had already been in and out of bankruptcy. It was scooped up out of bankruptcy by that financial consortium, Guggenheim and PIMCO, in 2018. And after raking in profits during Uri, the consortium flipped it for a quick profit in September 2021 by selling the plant to a Thai investment firm called BKV Bamboo. So all told, Winter Storm Uri left an immense human and infrastructural toll in a state that's seen numerous disasters stemming from climate change in recent years. And yet Uri was not a disaster for wide swaths of the financial sector. And what we've seen with Uri, with the California wildfires, Hurricane Helene, and many other recent disasters, they've really highlighted the fragility of our energy infrastructure and have raised really important questions about how to incentivize the creation of a cleaner and more resilient grid and how to do it quickly. Yet the stories that emerge from Uri demonstrate something else, how the financial sector is so thoroughly enmeshed in the US electricity sector. And so this is an important point, as changing our electricity system is going to take an enormous infusion of investment, as well as a major change in where that investment is going. And this highlights the importance of the financial sector and the potential transformation of the US electricity system. But the stories of Uri also provide a peek into something else. While the electricity sector is changing, the financial sector is changing too. These aren't just banks loaning money for infrastructure. They're buying and selling electricity. They're investing in renewables in exchange for tax credits. They're owning and operating power plants, and much, much more. So in Brokers of Power, I argue that it's increasingly the financial sector and financial imperatives that are brokering the reallocation of capital in the contemporary electricity system. In other words, it's finance that enables the continued investment in fossil fuel power generation. It is finance that is holding the keys to the potential reinvestment into low carbon energy sources. And this also means that it is the metrics of finance, things like shareholder value and profitability, that are largely determining how, when, and where the electricity sector transitions, if it transitions at all. So in the book, I analyze the electricity system as it has and continues to change, and this is a topic of much discussion over the last decade. Where this book differs is in my approach. Rather than a discussion of policy or technology, I try to start from the perspectives, decisions, and actions of the financial industry. I think this offers us a useful entry point, in part because, and this is sort of borrowing from Castrie's and Christopher's description, finance is the ultimate geographer of the energy transition. So through their decisions, financial actors translate money into fixed energy assets that'll shape human environments, climates, and economic futures over long periods of time. So questions like, should we build a gas plant in Massachusetts or a wind farm in Texas? Should we install batteries in suburban New York City or keep that diesel generator running in the Bronx? These sorts of questions are decreasingly technical. And while state and federal policy undoubtedly plays an important role in determining these decisions, the choices of where, what, and when to build are being made by financial firms using financial logics. What's more, financial logics do not easily integrate into a concern for a warming planet. Rather, the top priority for financial firms is profitability. So Brokers of Power is organized around one central question: how are financial actors' strategies and practices reshaping the energy transition? Sorry, the energy system. Yet it would be a folly to believe that finance is only a driver of change. Rather, finance is also very much part of the lack of change in the electricity industry. So stasis, particularly the continuing presence of greenhouse gas spewing generators on the grid, is a defining and, for environmentalists, a maddening element of the US electricity industry. As such, if we're to wonder why coal power plants persist, or why solar and wind, which are quite clearly the cheapest source of electricity generation since around 2021, why those are not the preferred modes of generation, we need not only ask about technology or policy, we need to rather understand how these policies and technologies intersect with the preferences and really imperatives of the financial sector. All right, so that's a overview of sort of the central argument of the book. This is how I'll lay out the talk from here. So I'm going to begin with a discussion of how I conceptualize the relationship between the financial and the electricity sectors. I'll talk a bit about methods, basically how I conducted the research for the book. And then I'll do a brief overview of the US electricity system. And I'll finish with some very short chapter overviews to provide kind of a view into how these ideas materialize in various chapters. Okay, so let's start with this. How can we conceptualize the relationship between finance and the electricity industry? So if we reflect on what we know about the Texas electricity system and Winter Storm Uri so far, we know that a lot of banks like JP Morgan or Bank of America, they made mountains of cash from trading electricity during Uri. And so in many ways, this is predictable. Large banks of this sort have entire operations dedicated to trading all sorts of things like oil or wheat or pork bellies or mortgages. Yet in the story of Uri, banks also showed up in some unexpected ways, like those banks that owned Temple Generation 1. And if we dig a bit deeper, we can find banks in other parts of the Texas electricity sector. Banks are the so-called tax equity investors that invest money in the growing number of wind and solar installations in the state. And these are the sorts of investments that earn those banks tax credits so that they can avoid paying taxes on their profits from, among other things, trading electricity. So in addition to banks, other financial industry players have been spotted in Texas. For example, there's entities like private equity or hedge funds, and these were all reported as circling around some of the remnants of the bankrupt or struggling energy firms that were on the wrong side of Uri. There was a lot of losers as well as these winners. And the largest shareholders of many of the publicly traded energy companies operating in Texas and the US as a whole are not individual investors. Rather, they're these really big financial entities like BlackRock, State Street, or Vanguard, these large asset managers that passively own large portions of the economy. So what's clear is that the tentacles of the financial industry have spread all throughout the electricity industry. But it's not just the financial industry, of course, right? There's the growing role, there's concern for the growing role that the financial industry plays in the global economy. And it's not gone unnoticed to scholars and commentators who frequently remark that the US and the global economy have become financialized. So what exactly the term financialization refers to is contested. At times, financialization is used to describe the growing proportion of profits attributed to financial firms rather than the rest of the economy. Financialization can also be defined, as the anthropologist Daniel Scott Souleles describes, as the growing use of financial models, instruments, and logics as a way to reorganize companies and extract wealth, a trend that, in many ways, represents an intensification of conventional capitalism. And still others have pointed to the financialization of everyday life, where individuals have become kind of unwitting participants in the global financial system through their pensions, their mortgages, their credit card balances, or as many of us probably know about, your student loans. So financialization is something of an unsettled term, but what my interest here is not to try to better define financialization, but rather I really want to hone in on this question of the relationship between finance and the so-called real or industrial economy. And this effort has been at the center of the work of Stephen Maher and Scott Aquano. If you're interested in finance, I would really recommend checking out their work. And they've written a series of articles and books that have outlined what they talk about as the new finance capital. So I'll kind of outline what their argument is, and it's something that I subscribe to as well. So there's the common view, right, that financialization is simply this case of a parasitical financial industry that leeches profits and money out of the real industrial economy. And they say that this is not correct. They've got some reasons that they go into, and you'll see some of them in just a moment. They also, there's another view, right, that financialization is about the growing, relative empowerment of the financial sector versus the industrial corporation. And again, they say this is too simplistic of an account. This doesn't really capture what's actually going on. Rather, and this is my entry into trying to do some animation in PowerPoint, what they refer to here is that the new finance capital is supposed to capture what has effectively been a fusion between the financial corporation and the industrial corporation, right? And what we see here in this fusion is that the financial industry has increased its ownership and its control of non-financial corporations. As well as the fact that these non-financial corporations, these industrial corporations, have been remade in the image of finance. They've internalized a lot of these financial practices, metrics, and practices. So this is a big insertion. We'll take a little bit of time to think about what this actually means. So we can start with the changing relationship between financial and industrial corporations. And if we think about this in its historical context, the early 20th century saw finance, and this is investment banks like JP Morgan, that could control large swaths of the industrial economy through what were known as interlocking directorships. In the post-World War II era, government regulation of monopolies and the regulation of monopolies, as well as the financial industry, combined with the growing power of labor, saw company managers emerge as the primary force that were directing corporate operations. However, with the rise of neoliberalism during the latter half of the 20th century, the split between corporate ownership, so think about like shareholders, and corporate control, this was at that time company management, came in for critique. What resulted from that was a growing belief that managers were not always acting in the shareholders' best interest. And the shareholders argued that the primary role of the corporation was to produce value for them, produce value for the shareholders. So in the 1980s, we saw this rise of hostile takeovers by activist investors, and that kind of converted this belief into reality. Here I use the example of Carl Icahn and some of these other so-called corporate raiders. And what we saw then is that the financial industry once again reasserted their control over corporate operations and strategies. And so this influence of the financial industry over industrial operations continued into the 21st century. After the 2008 financial crisis, this only heightened financial control over the industry. And this is where we saw activist investors, so things like private equity or hedge funds, they've been joined by passive investors, these large asset management companies like BlackRock and Vanguard that control large portions of publicly traded corporations through their ownership of index funds. So I've already pointed towards the increasing ownership of power plants and investor-owned utilities by financial entities. And in subsequent chapters in the book, I explore these models of investment, their impacts on the electricity sector in more depth. But for now, it's simply worth repeating Maher and Aquano's assertion that the line between the financial and the non-financial corporation has never been thinner. So ownership and control of industrial corporations and assets is only part of the story, though. As Maher and Aquano have argued, the industrial corporation has also been remade in the image of finance. And so we can provide, along the same timeline, another kind of useful historical perspective. So over the course of the 20th century, corporate operations have become more complex and more diversified. With that change came the need for corporate managers to begin allocating resource between many disparate businesses. So let's take General Electric as an example. Across the 20th century, it moved from being involved in steam turbines and generating equipment to being involved in consumer appliances and trains, into things like insurance, media, and financial services. And ultimately today they have three divisions: aerospace, power, and renewable energy. So if you imagine a General Electric executive, they can no longer really be reasonably expect to have operational expertise in any of these business units. Rather, the role of the executive shifted to become allocators of capital and resources between these independently operated entities. And in doing so, corporate officers essentially have set up an internal market for capital that makes these allocation decisions using a variety of financial metrics, but especially those that measure a business's rate of return. Okay, so that's kind of our big picture here. What I want to do here is start to build a conceptual toolkit and a bit of a vocabulary that allows us to think about finance and the real economy or the industrial economy. And I start here with these political economy approaches to the studies of finance, especially thinking about David Harvey's work on capital switching and the spatial fix, right? And what we're talking about here is the allocation of investment from one economic sector or geographic location to another in order to stave off challenges to profitability. And so when we look at it in this way, the financial industry is a critical actor that allocates and reallocates money. And it almost acts like a central nervous system of the wider economy. It facilitates that movement of investment from one place to another. But what Maher and Aquano's crucial intervention is to transition that metaphor inside of the corporation, right? Pointing to the internal capital market that exists in these modern firms, right? So to give a concrete example, here I have an investor-owned utility with a number of different divisions: a gas division, renewables, transmission, and retail division. So imagine that this investor-owned utility could make a decision like reinvesting funds away from their gas division into a renewables division, right? This is an internal decision that's made, and it implies little direct involvement by outside actors, but it's a decision that's made, with finance and profitability in mind. But to think about this in reality, we have to remember that this is an investor-owned utility, meaning that it's owned by shareholding investors. And rather than supporting a move that would reinvest funds into renewables from gas, those shareholders might say, actually, surplus profits need to come to us, right, in the form of dividends. That is the best use of that money because the shareholders know how best to reinvest money for the highest possible pay back. So that's one example. We can also think about how is the switch of capital switching from the perspective of a bank, right? And we can see a bank here that's deciding to lend money to a solar farm, let's say, rather than to a gas power plant. And they could make this decision based on a lot of things, but most likely it's going to be based on what they see as the potential returns that come from that solar farm. Or we could imagine a big group of investors that's invested in investor-owned utility and then some other sort of utility that's maybe more interested in green energy, let's say. And that those investors could swap their investment from one to another based upon how they prioritize returns primarily, but also maybe some views about fossil fuels and the future of fossil fuels. So those are all ways that finance is switched, right, between industries, projects, and companies. But at each stage, there are decisions, and I've kind of alluded to this. There's decisions that need to be made either internally or externally by financial entities. So in addition to this idea of capital switching, I also draw on approaches from the social studies of science, or social studies of finance, sorry, that help us to analyze the tools, models, and instruments that financiers use to calculate risks and profits. And here I've cited Donald McKenzie and some colleagues that have done a lot of work in this industry. And so this social studies of finance approach might call our attention to the financial models that are used by a group like securities analysts. These are like stock pickers, and in their quest to quantify what they believe is an objective underlying value of a particular company. And that analysts' financial models attempt to value firms based upon what they refer to as the fundamentals: their revenues, their profits, their debt, and then determine if a particular firm is currently overvalued or undervalued as it's trading on the stock market. And such a model might find that the utility is overvalued, given that the long-term outlook for fossil fuels is precarious, and the analysts may then advise shareholders to move away from that particular firm. Um, Social studies of finance will also draw our attention to questions of risk, right? And particularly calculations of risk and returns and how those might change in particular policy environments. So as we can see, both political economy and social studies of finance approaches can yield different insights into changes in the US electricity system, yet they've both been subject to critique. For its part, political economy tends to privilege the sphere of production rather than that of exchange. And when markets are considered, they are viewed simply as the place where competition plays out, surplus value is realized. But while social studies of finance approaches can lend the detailed insights that enable closer study of market functioning, those same approaches tend to avoid questions of how the relations of power focus in the design and implementation of market devices and instruments. So it's with these critiques, as well as others, in mind that I draw from both of these approaches in the book. And I think Maher and Aquano have pointed the way in this regard. It's crucial to understand both the blurring line between the financial and electricity industries and the ways that the electricity industry is being shaped by financial imperatives, measures, and expectations. So I believe that using both these political economy and social studies of finance approaches enables a cross-scalar analysis, right? That, like investment capital, it moves across and through firms, through actors to different geographic locations and different generation technologies. So in this way, finance is conceptualized as heavily involved in the aforementioned role of capital switching, right? Moving investments from outside and inside of industrial firms and between various forms of electricity infrastructure, right? Always with the ultimate potential, but not reality, right? Of moving away from fossil fuels and towards cleaner forms of production. Importantly, the story is not just about how finance is doing something to another industry. Right. I also seek in this book to understand how the financial industry functions in and of itself. Okay. Quick drink of water. So that's a bit on the conceptual toolkit that I built up. Now I want to talk for a little bit about how I've attempted to study this industry. So in October of 2018, I attended my first electricity finance conference in Midtown Manhattan in New York. And as I made my way from the subway to the conference location, I was pretty nervous about the day, but I felt like I at least looked the part. I was a white male in my late 30s, and I was wearing a suit. It's the first time I'd had that suit on since the last wedding that I'd been to the year before. After going through the registration line, I entered the hotel ballroom. That was what I came to know was typical of these events. It's a large audience, several hundred attendees. They were seated at rows of tables with panels comprised of 4 to 6 speakers sitting at comfortable chairs on a stage in the front of the room. Looked pretty much exactly like this picture that you see here on the right. Each of the panels would be guided by a moderator, and they were seemingly always from a corporate law firm specializing in energy finance. And they would ask questions about topics like debt markets, tax equity, and alternative financing and power markets. And another one would be called Power Market Mergers and Acquisition Trends, an Investment Banking Perspective. And so I mentioned this, but despite conducting research on the electricity sector since 2009, I had minimal background in finance. And when I look back at my notes from those first few conferences, it was really like I was learning a new language. Investopedia, which is an online investment dictionary, it quickly became my version of Google Translate. As I was sitting there listening to people talk about something called mezzanine debt, I would wonder what they're talking about. And Investopedia would inform me that this is a type of financing that allows the lender to convert their loan into an ownership or equity stake if the loan isn't paid back. Or they might be talking about the capital stack or the capital structure. An Investopedia would explain to me that the capital stack is the combination of debt and equity that a company uses to finance its overall operations and growth. And at these first couple of conferences, I spent most of my time scribbling down terms, looking them up, and really just trying to make sense of what the panelists were talking about. And the conferences are costly to attend. So thank you to the National Science Foundation and the University of South Carolina for providing some funding to cover the cost. Unlike most academic conferences I've attended, they also include things like breakfasts, snack breaks, sit-down lunches, cocktail hours. And these provided built-in opportunities to chat with other attendees. Most of the people saw I had a university affiliation on my name badge and asked me why I was there. Many assumed I taught courses on electricity finance. Definitely not true. But I use these opportunities to ask questions about what these people did in their jobs, why they were attending the conference, and clarification about various things the panelists discussed. It was during these brief and informal conversations that I started to understand the wide variety of financial institutions and entities that exist. So with some additional help from Investopedia, I started to sort out what investment banks do. They help corporate customers raise money in the stock market and facilitate mergers and acquisitions. And I've started to realize how investment banks are different than what I always thought were normal banks or commercial banks. So it was also in these conversations I started to understand more about what it takes to get an electricity generation project actually built, which brings us into ideas like project finance. So as I started to attend these conferences, I also started to notice some differences between different parts of the financial industry. I liked going to the project finance conferences because these people were actually talking about trying to build things, trying to actually get projects built and off the ground. I didn't like the electricity traders as much. They made lots of presentations that would sprinkle in quotes from neoliberal evangelists like Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman. And I also thought the prevailing ideologies of the electricity trading conferences were probably best encapsulated by one conference's keynote speaker, who was Harvard professor William Hogan. Hogan is one of the primary architects of electricity deregulation in the US. And as he discussed the various ills of the US electricity system, his conclusion was that they all originated from the same common affliction. Deregulated electricity markets were simply not deregulated enough. So over the course of a few years, I went to 6 of these conferences, mostly in New York, but also in Charlotte and Houston. Using the connections I made at these conferences, I was able to conduct semi-structured interviews with more than 50 people working in electricity finance. I also tried to fill in the gaps in my knowledge, which were pretty extreme, by taking some specialized training classes, including one that was on electricity trading, which is called Structuring Hedges and Trades. And I also completed a 6-week online solar MBA. I also developed so in the course of doing the work, I tried to develop a number of case studies using both the interviews that I conducted as well as a range of archival documents and industry press. I pulled all sorts of information from specialized financial databases that my university had subscriptions to, things like Bloomberg and Preqin, which helps you to find private equity information, as well as data from regulatory agencies, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and the Energy Information Administration. There's a lot of data out there if you know how to access it, and even more if you can interpret what it actually means. Okay, so that's kind of how I conceptualized the relationship between electricity and finance, how I went about studying the industry. But the implication that I've made throughout this has been that the US electricity industry is changing. So let's spend some time talking about what those changes are, and we can start with the case of Texas again. Many of you have probably seen this photo. In the aftermath of the blackouts after Uri, this picture made the rounds on social media, with a lot of right-wing commentators trying to assign blame for the blackouts to wind turbines. They famously posted this picture claiming that it took fossil fuels to make the wind turbines work again. Of course, it later came out that this picture came from a Swedish advertising campaign that had run years before Uri. But in some ways, their reason for targeting wind is clear. Wind energy has become a much larger part of the Texas electricity system. You can see it in the orange line, the increase between 2009 and 2023. And in fact, in some months, wind is the single largest source on the Texas electricity grid. This is just a couple of months after Uri. Wind generates the most power. I think it was actually the month after Uri. Wind was the single largest generator of power in Texas. And so the trends that we see in Texas are similar to what we see in the US as a whole. Wind and renewables have grown substantially, right? You can see them down at the bottom in the orange and green of this chart. Coal has declined substantially. That's the line in the black. And natural gas has increased as well. That's the line in the red. If you zoom in even more on renewables, you can see that they're projected to be a major source of generation growth, likely continuing to make up ground on natural gas generation. Happy to answer questions about what people have questions about what's going to happen with the new administration. I have some thoughts, but I'll move past those for now. Similarly, this is potentially going to change. But while all this was happening, this change in generation sources, the magnitude of electricity demand in the US has basically been stagnant. So this chart shows between 2001 and 2023. And if you look from the top line in the blue, which is all the generation together, from about 2009 to 2023, the amount of demand has basically been flat, right? It's largely been stagnant. So there are a lot of projections about the demand is going to be back on the increase. And again, I'm happy to answer those questions. People have that in the question and answer section. But as mentioned, the blame for the blackouts in Texas was initially placed on the types of generation that were being used. However, other critics and commentators soon began to question if the blackouts might be due to the structure of Texas's so-called deregulated electricity grid. So what does it mean for an electricity grid to be deregulated? And we could spend probably a whole day looking at these charts and explaining what they mean, but I'm going to try to run through them really quickly. So what I have here is 4 kind of generalized models of how electricity markets work. So model 1 is a vertically integrated natural monopoly, which was the primary way electricity markets were arranged for most of the 20th century. And in this situation, a single company is responsible for all aspects of electricity provision. Model 2 shows a slight variation of this that started to happen in the wake of the 1970s energy crises, where we needed more generation on the grid, and the thought of the way to do it was to allow smaller power producers, which are named independent power producers, to gain access to what had been that monopoly-controlled grid. Model 3 depicts a sort of halfway deregulation, and this is what we have in a lot of states across the US. So in these cases, monopoly utilities were required to separate their generation and distribution businesses. In some cases, they were required to divest their generation assets entirely. These separate generation businesses would then compete to sell electricity into a single wholesale power market. Right? And then you have an investor-owned distributor who buys their power out of that wholesale market and then sells it on to customers. Model 4 is most representative of what Texas is, where you have deregulated generation with competitors selling it into a wholesale market. And then you have a variety of retailers who will buy that power out of the generation and then sell it to a variety of customers. So this is what we have in Texas, and we have it in 7 states in the US total, right, where we've moved to Model 4. The result, if you want to put it on a map, is something like this. We have a patchwork of different regulatory constructs across the US, with some states being served by wholesale markets, while those that are in the gray continue to have vertically integrated utilities. we also end up with something like this, what you can think of as the electricity industry alphabet soup. So you have investor-owned utilities or IOUs, and these can own a mix of regulated and deregulated subsidiaries after the repeal of the Public Utility Holding Company Act of 1935, right? And these utilities and their regulated entities are most interested in growing their rate base. They just want to get more stuff that they can charge customers for. You can contrast that against independent power producers, these IPPs. And these are non-utility producers of power that compete in those wholesale markets. As of 2022, about 47% of the electricity generated in the US comes from IPPs. And it's important to realize that for these, in addition to selling power, they also have very active roles in electricity trading, hedging, and then using all sorts of financial leverage in order to meet their return targets. One of the trends, though, that we can see across the electricity sector is for those that operate in the deregulated industry, is that it's really difficult for them, for these IPPs, to consistently earn the money that they need. And it's because of that, it's difficult for those electricity markets to attract the generation that they need to maintain their reliability. So they're always trying to introduce new forms of regulation, essentially, to draw in the production that they need into those deregulated markets. And so it's partially for this reason that in the aftermath of Uri, the Texas legislature has taken a number of steps to become much more regulated and try and guarantee levels of compensation, particularly for natural gas generators. Okay, so that's a bit of an overview of the US system as a whole. And so what I'm going to do for the rest is just give a quick overviews of the chapters that follow. So what I've done in each of the chapters is I try to take on a part of the electricity system, the solar industry, for example, or coal power plants, or the investor-owned utilities or deregulated utilities, and to look at how those intersect with some part of the financial industry. Remember, there's this fusion between them. So I'll start by talking about Chapter 2, right, which follows a utility that was called Dynegy. It's now Vistra Energy, which was a Houston, Texas-based energy company that paralleled and in some cases mimicked the innovative and now infamous Enron. So in the late 1990s, Dynegy was among the leaders of what was known as the energy convergence, a shift in business model that argued electricity market restructuring was about more than just introducing competition. Rather, it was the belief that restructuring should bring about a fundamentally different relationship between electricity and financial industries. And it was underpinned by the belief that these integrated energy firms like Dynegy could squeeze more profit out of the regulated electricity industry by using financial methods. Again, these things like hedges, trades, and structures to take advantage of arbitrage opportunities and cyclical commodity prices. As such, the case of Dynegy really illustrates the growing power of finance within these industrial corporations, effectively demonstrating the fusion of the financial and industrial corporation. Chapter 3 investigates investor-owned utilities, and it builds on an article I wrote a few years ago about accumulation strategies in the utility market. It focuses in on two of the largest electric utilities in the US, Duke Energy, and then NextEra, which not only is the most valuable utility in the US, it's also the world's largest owner and operator of renewable energy. So I chart both these companies' trajectories from the mid-1990s into the early 2020s in order to demonstrate both the financial sector's changing expectation of what a successful utility should look like, and to chart the increasing financialization of the utilities themselves. In this chapter, I also engage with that crucial political economic question of ownership and control, particularly as it relates to financial firms and asset managers that own a vast majority of utility stock. And as I mentioned a few times, much of this is held in passive index funds, right? These funds that track the performance of a group of stock that are managed by groups like Vanguard and BlackRock. The question that I explore is whether we should expect that these passive owners will take an active interest around the question of climate change and renewable energy. And I'll just give you a little spoiler, it's highly unlikely that they will. Chapter 4 engages with the question of industry exit. So how and why do coal power plants shut down? As previously noted, electricity generation from coal has been on the decline in the first 2 decades of the 21st century. And so I start the chapter by looking at the increasingly poor financial performance of coal power plants, particularly those operating in restructured markets that use so-called capacity markets, which are essentially auctions that pay winners to provide power at some point in the future. I also look at regulated markets where the decision to shut down coal plants has been shaped by a different set of forces. But both of these decisions are highly shaped by the potential to use different financial mechanisms, primarily accelerated depreciation or a technique known as securitization that allows ratepayers to fund the shutdown of coal plants. And in doing so, this highlights the role of investment banks in brokering bond sales for the securitization effort. And it illustrates how investment banks like Citibank, even as they were supposed to be stepping away from coal mining, are able to profit even when they're involved in just shutting coal down. Chapter 5 focuses on the case of North Carolina, a state that in 2019 had the second most installed solar in the US. And North Carolina's solar boom was rooted in the ability of financiers to structure financial deals. This was the technique of project finance. So this chapter focuses in on the question of project finance, and I draw on interviews with project finance experts to detail how these deals are structured and how they used a combination of equity and debt and loan guarantees and tax credits and long-term power purchase agreements to make solar investment become profitable. Almost there. So North Carolina's solar market has since cooled, but the opportunities for solar development have accelerated around the US. So no longer are solar projects only being developed in those states with the most favorable set of incentives. So as of mid-2023, there were almost 100 gigawatts of solar projects that were either under construction or being developed in nearly every state in the US. And so in Chapter 6, I focus in on one financial industry, private equity, that's capitalizing on the growth of solar. So private equity firms make investments in companies, but they do so outside of the public markets. And in this chapter, I draw on interviews with private equity firms to examine how they operate, noting their reliance on leverage, their preference for quickly selling the companies they acquire, as well as their preference for investing only in certain parts of the solar development industry. So because of their desire for returns that can outperform what investors would make in the public markets, private equity firms prefer to invest in the very earliest and therefore riskiest stages of solar development. One thing that we've learned about private equity firms is that they can make money even when their acquisitions go bankrupt. So the question that I examine is, what does this mean for the energy transition? Okay, and then in the book's conclusion, I draw on some of the community-based research I've been conducting in Columbia, South Carolina, where I live, to demonstrate how this book can be useful for advocates for a cleaner and more just energy system. So in Columbia, there's an ongoing effort to shutter a large investor-owned coal power plant, which you can see in the background of this picture, as well as a recently opened utility-scale solar and storage facility. Using these examples, I highlight how the ongoing reshaping of the electricity industry, so one in which financial firms and financial logics are driving the expansion and contraction of electricity infrastructure, how those affect communities in crucial ways, specifically around questions of land ownership, around energy prices, and around the overall benefits and burdens of hosting energy infrastructure. I believe that this example highlights how financial techniques like securitization or entities like investment banks and private equity, these topics and entities that often seem really far away from the concerns of everyday people, I think it really highlights how this can have very long-lasting impacts on the places that we live and on the future of life on this planet. Okay, I will wrap it up there. and I'm happy to take any questions. Just want to acknowledge some of the different funders that help support this project. And I should probably also add the numerous people that helped me conduct this research.
Thank you so much, Connor, for the talk. Some people may have had to go because they're on to other things. But if you, especially you, Connor, if you have a few minutes to field some questions, I'm happy to help facilitate. So, those of you, if you have questions, feel free to either raise your Zoom hand or write a question in the chat. Or you could just simply unmute if you're feeling courageous. Don't be bashful. So I'll wait a second to see if anyone has any questions. Okay, it looks like Shay, go ahead. Yes, please ask your question.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm so glad that you sent the email blast this morning, like today. Great. Thanks so much for this talk and this book, Connor. I'm a labor geographer who is more recent to studying the energy transition, specifically in Indonesia's geothermal transition. And I'm curious, has geothermal come across your radar? Um, has any kind of Has anything come across your radar with respect to that energy source and the transformation of grids, the politics of and political economy of incorporating renewables into existing grid systems, which I'm collaborating with an electrical engineer, and turns out it's quite challenging. So I wonder, um, with all of the activities of private equity investing and preferring to invest in like the earliest stages and the riskiest, I was wondering if you could talk more about that because I think it's not just solar and wind that this applies to. I think we're going to see more and more geothermal. And my newest project is looking at how it's expanding in the United States and the American West through both household scale heat pumps, which aren't really geothermal plants, and proposed industrial scale geothermal plants. But communities have varying perceptions of the risk, whereas and private equity is very interested, and the state of Colorado is very interested in investing in bore well drilling, but I think possibly not beyond that. So thank you so much, and it's a pleasure to meet.
Yeah, thanks for those questions. I didn't come across geothermal a lot in this work, and that could have been partially because of the time period that I was doing most of this research. Previous projects that I worked on in the Caribbean was very geothermal centric. There, a lot of kind of volcanic activity, um, and there's lots and lots of talk about it there. Your question about sort of private equity and geothermal is an interesting one because to my knowledge, geothermal development timelines are historically a little bit longer, right? And so one of the things that I've, learned about private equity is that they make investments in companies. Um, and so, but they don't like to have those investments indefinitely. They usually have a kind of get in and get out way of doing things. So I don't know this for a fact, but I wonder how the sort of temporality of geothermal would affect a private equity investor, the way that they thought about it. That would be something I would investigate. That's a good question.
We do have a question in the chat from Zach. I don't know, Zach, if you'd like to unmute and ask it or if you'd like me to read it.
Yeah, I can. I was just trying to be
Okay,
concise.
sure.
So I wrote, "Hi Connor, it's wonderful to finally hear you speak. And it's you're always a really great explainer of the financial aspects of the energy system. Um, yeah, I'm just curious because I hear so much um, in discourse around speculative power, like we need to build all these battery storage systems for these computing and computing. Sorry, I'm in Philadelphia and I was out partying on last night because the Eagles won the Super Bowl. So I'm missing words. So that's why I wanted to write it out. But yeah, I just wanted your take on like this kind of speculative demand. And I think for me, it really drives like this growth of the energy system discourse. And to me, that's really like I'm just trying to see how that's connected to the financialization of the energy system. So sorry for my waspy voice as well.
Yeah, that's a boy, that's a great question. I can think about it in a couple of different registers that I'll take that question. The one is, the last 2 years I've seen the kind of AI data center hype, right? And I kind of alluded to this, that there's this thought that electricity demand is going to go sky high, right? And this is every single state in the country is making this claim or has been making this claim. And a lot of it is based off these data centers. And I mean, and in some respects, I mean, the amount of power that those things are sucking up is incredible. I saw just the other day that supposedly in the state of Virginia, a third of the power that's generated in the state goes to data centers. So there's no doubt that they're huge. There's also no doubt that a lot of the sort of, if you think about a lot of these like renewable energy developments, the project finance, you need to have a source to kind of do the construction. You also have a source that's going to be or a buyer of that power, right? And so a lot of the data centers and AI and clean tech and all this kind of stuff, they are they're the buyers for a lot of this new power. So they've kind of been the completing end of it. All that said, I think a lot of those forecasts are kind of, put it bluntly, bullshit. You've already seen just in, like 2 weeks ago with this DeepSeek thing, it basically blew up all of the forecasts of for data centers. And one of the remarkable things is that one of the companies that I profile, Dynegy or Vistra now, they were sort of dead in the water in terms of a stock. Their price wouldn't move no matter what. And then they got caught up in the last 2 years with all of the AI stuff. So they became, instead of being correlated with natural gas as an investment, they started to get correlated with NVIDIA. And so they saw their stock went to heights that had never been seen before for the company. And then DeepSeek came out and their price crashed just overnight. So I think it's still being worked out, but I think it's a super interesting question, something I'm really keeping an eye on.
Gareth, you have your hand up. Would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks, Conor. That was really interesting, and yeah, I look forward to reading it as well. I guess the question comes from like my own research is looking at the UK and electricity and the energy crisis there, so I guess it comes from a bit more from that perspective. And I think you kind of hinted at it. You talked about Trump and things like this. I guess like I'm just interested to ask a bit more about like the state in this kind of equation, like whether that's the literal state as in Texas or this federal state in the US context, because it seems like, especially when you're looking at the recent energy crisis, which I appreciate hit Europe perhaps more so than it did the US. The state has had to, or is being called upon to take more active roles in interventions into electricity, and often in the UK case is doing it without a complete misunderstanding of how the electricity system works, partly because it doesn't really understand the finance structures and things like this, but is attempting to kind of coerce and sort of de-risk electricity investment, right, in order to get more renewables, etc., onto the grid, and the implications of like really higher costs for consumers. So I just was interested to ask maybe a bit more about the role of the state, like in general, in these relationships, and perhaps how it's maybe changing either through, obviously Inflation Reduction Act, Trump, etc., how that is kind of potentially reshaping electricity or not, possibly.
Yeah. So I mean, well, you can think about it in a couple of different ways. I think you point to the fact that if you look at the way that Nikki, Luke, and Matt Hubert described it as kind of electricity capital, right? It's this kind of blend between the industry, finance, and the state. Probably to a certain extent in this presentation, I've downplayed the role of the state. In the book, I try to get more into that kind of interaction between policy, like state policies, and the financial part of it, especially around like tax credits, because that's basically been what U.S. electricity policy is tax incentives to do things. There are other parts of it too. And it's important to consider, right, that a big part of the United States is still regulated. You know, that many states, South Carolina, where I live, is an investor in utility, that's a monopoly. And if you look at the justification that the utility gives when it goes before the Public Service Commission, before the regulators, is that they need certain returns so that they can remain attractive to financial markets. And so the state is very much a kind of moderator, or it helps. In theory, it should be kind of finding the blend between protecting customers and keeping capital markets happy. And I think you start to see that in these other places as well. I mean, the thing that we see in the deregulated markets is that they don't really work very well for electricity. So there's always these levels of sort of state support or additional designs of new kinds of markets that are going to be blended on top to try to, it's like, I think it's the deregulated markets are the most complicated things I've ever seen in my life when it comes to rules and regulations. So it's kind of the state is kind of carries over. It's an essential commodity, right? So we can't, as I say, like to my students, like we don't really want the utility to go out of business tomorrow. We'd be screwed. We probably wanted to do something different, but certainly getting the electricity to us is important. But that's a great question.
Okay, Shay, I don't know if you have another quick question or comment. I see that your hand's up, but I also wanted to give Conor a chance as we start to wrap up to address those two questions that were kind of bookmarked during your talk. One about whether demand may remain stagnant and what you think about that. And the question, which, grudgingly is on everyone's mind about what will happen with the new US administration vis-a-vis some of the things you're talking about. But Shay, did you want to say one more thing? And I'll just collect any final questions or comments, and I think we'll try to wrap up soon.
Thanks, Tiffany. Let's just move to those, and I can reach out to you, Conor. I had a question about like the world of finance work in this scenario. So let's just move along, and I can ask another time.
Yeah, happy to talk about that. Shay, if you just whenever you want to get in touch. I think the demand maybe I already touched on. I'm a little bit of a skeptic. There's a long history of very aggressive demand forecasts that haven't come to be. And in some ways, you can understand why the utilities would put those out there. They get compensated by building more stuff in a lot of parts of the US. And they also don't want to be wrong on the short side. So I try to have a little bit of sympathy for them. That's about as much as I have. When it comes to the Trump administration, every day I think I've got it figured out. It changes a little bit. I think that there's so much momentum around the Inflation Reduction Act that I think he's certainly gone after wind, right? He's gone after offshore wind. But offshore wind in the US was kind of not doing so great even before, right? Onshore wind has been in a little bit of a decline for the last few years and probably is, more important than ever. I think solar is going to continue, and I think a lot of the investments in kind of clean manufacturing, electric vehicles are going to stay. I live in a very red state that has been the beneficiary of an incredible amounts of investment because of the Inflation Reduction Act. And, everyone from our legislators to our governor are all basically, have been at these ribbon cuttings, like they're not hiding from that, even though they all voted against the Inflation Reduction Act. So I tend to think that those are going to remain, at least in some part. I think a lot of the justice aspects of tax credits and things like that are going to get cut out, but I think that those are going to survive in some form. There was one other thing I was going to say. I think if I was going to give advice to people that really want more low carbon energy on the grid, I think people need to go all in on nuclear. I mean, I wouldn't have said this 4 or 5 years ago. I've been a really big critic of nuclear projects in the past, in part because the states I've lived in have been sort of crippled at various times because of cost overruns from nuclear. But to me, that seems like if those projects don't get started now, then we're, when I think we probably could get some things going, I think that we're kind of screwed. So that's how's that for a bad note to end on?
I was going to say, on that note, I just want to, wrap us up and say thank you so very much again, Conor, for your talk. So excited about the book. Can't wait to read it. And let's keep these discussions going. And thank you everyone for coming. And yeah, thank you so much. And I don't know, Maddie, do you want to quickly plug our next talk?
Yeah, so not this Friday, but the following one, we're co-sponsoring a talk with Miles Lennon from Brown University with the Black Geography Specialty Group, where he'll be sharing some of his research on solar power and racial capitalism. So hope to see lots of you there. That's at 2 p.m., I think, Friday the 21st.
Thank you again, everyone, and have a great rest of your week.